What does human flourishing mean to you?
Yes, it's the question reminds me of the question addressed to Louis Armstrong by a reporter. He said, "Mr. Armstrong, can you define what jazz is?" And he says, "If you have to ask, you're never going to know." And flourishing is some kind of like that, in that it is what people strive for, it is what they want, it's what they choose if given the freedom to do so. At least if they were in the frame of thinking of the long-term course of their lives, because we all are faced with trade-offs between immediate pleasure, which I think we wouldn't call flourishing, and a deeper satisfaction over the course of our lives. I would add, there's something unsatisfying about the answer to the question being, well, just ask people and whatever they want. That's what flourishing must be. Because I think we can do a little bit better, and we could say, what do people tend toward when they do reflect over the course of their lives? What matters? And I think it often coincides with the prerequisites to having that conversation in the first place, to asking that question. And there are things like, well, most obviously, life. If we weren't alive, we couldn't even be having this conversation. We couldn't even consider the question, which in turn means health, because health is strongly related to the probability of being alive and not dying, but also nutrition and a certain degree of comfort. Since we are inherently social beings, we evolved by a process that's inherently social, namely sexual reproduction. So the fact that you exist means that you are the end of a lineage of people who found mates and had sex and probably were in love if they were able to bring up children. So you got love and human connection. If you're pondering it, well, you had to have been in a community that had language. So you must have been because no one can invent a language by themselves. So you're part of a community. You also must have a certain amount of education in the sense of that question even making sense to you. So a lot of the things that I think we would identify as essential to flourishing are not only things that people tend to opt for, but also things that are prerequisite to them being alive and healthy and social and educated enough even to have the conversation.
All right, thank you. Tyler, human flourishing.
I think a lot of resonance with what Steve said. The working definition we've been using at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard is that flourishing is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, so very all-encompassing, but not all that helpful in practice, given the wide scope of it, and also complicated, because how that is understood, what is considered good, is going to vary to a certain extent by culture and tradition. And so what we've tried to do at the Human Flourishing program is to focus on what seems in common across different traditions, different cultures. And so what I would argue is that whatever else might be involved in human flourishing, the following 5 domains of human life would be at least part of any reasonable conception. And the list doesn't look all that different from Steve's. Happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Our argument's not that this exhausts what human flourishing is, but each, I think, is a part of it. I think each of those things is an end in and of itself. It's sought for its own sake, not merely a means to other ends. And each is nearly universally desired, and we have some empirical data on this as well. And I think those 2 criteria, being an end, being nearly universally desired, might help shape consensus around how to approach this topic. There's a great deal of consensus that we ought to promote health, that we ought to promote economic well-being, and I think those things are essential. But I think we can often attain a broader consensus in society to include things like meaning and like relationships, like happiness, and that it's worthwhile to do so. So I think that's a good starting point, but as I said, I think any given understanding of a flourishing life is going to move beyond that, is going to be yet more full, yet richer still. And so for much of the world's population, one has some sort of notion of religious or spiritual well-being. And I think it's difficult to navigate these questions in the context of a pluralistic society because those understandings do differ. I think if one were to try to assess progress that each of these communities sees themselves as making towards their own religious or spiritual ends, it would require tradition-specific assessment. So it's not particularly straightforward. And I think within the Christian understanding of well-being or flourishing, that spiritual well-being is some sort of final communion with God. And sort of Thomas Aquinas' understanding in various parts of the Christian tradition, that's seen as kind of a final vision or understanding of God imparted by God himself. That may seem very abstract, but to try to make it more concrete, I mean, one can imagine the joy of proving a mathematical theorem or solving some difficult problem, or alternatively, the joy of listening to an organ fugue by Bach or whatever else your favorite music is, or the joy of encountering a long-lost friend after a lengthy absence. And if you imagine all those joys kind of brought together, the intellectual, the emotional, the relational, and then amplified by 100-fold, I'd say that's still a poor description of the sort of the final Christian vision of what true flourishing is, that final communion with God.
Thank you both. All right, the next topic is hope in humanity. Should we have hope in humanity? Now, I know neither of you is an engineer, and some people here maybe are putting their hope in technology. We've done a forum on that. But let's talk about humanity. Does humanity trend toward dystopia or utopia? And should we have hope in humanity? Maybe start with you this time.
To my mind, the question of whether humanity tends towards dystopia or utopia is sort of a contingent matter. It's not predetermined. It depends on the actions of free individuals, and so I think we need to work hard to make it tend towards a utopia, but it is not a given conclusion. I think if we ensure that our arguments and approaches are reasonable, and if we also aim for kind of the highest aspirations of mankind, sort of not just focused on material goods, that also, but also seeking meaning, trying to develop the person as a whole, I think in general we'll be tending more towards utopia. But in the absence of reason, or in the absence of those higher aspirational goals, I think we can tend towards dystopia. But a lot of it is dependent on what we as individuals and as communities do. Should we have faith in, or hope in humanity? I mean, I think we should. And I sort of understand hope as fixing one's attention on the possibility of a good outcome, even in the face of difficulties. And I think there are real difficulties and problems, challenges that we're confronting, but I think there are reasons for hope. I mean, the central section of Stephen's book, Enlightenment Now, traces the extraordinary progress over the centuries with regard to longevity, with regard to literacy, with regard to declines in violence. There are signs of hope. I think there are signs of concern as well. Levels of trust have declined. Levels of meaning and purpose seem to be higher in poorer developing countries than the richer developed world. So have there been losses there? Sense of community participation has been declining. So I think there are indications that we ought to be concerned as well. And again, I think the ultimate outcome really is dependent on what we do as individuals, as a community. And I think this comes down to because the human person is free, that even with the best science, the best technology, the best reason, there's no guarantee that we will use those tools for good. Reason and science can help point towards what's good, but can't make a person good. And so, for that, again, I think we need to work as individuals and as a community towards that goodness. But I think there are limits there. And so I think if we're hoping for a perfect rationality or a perfect goodness in this life, I think we're bound to be disappointed. And I think for that, I would suggest, our ultimate hope is in a different horizon. It's a hope in God to bring about a more final and complete transformation.
Before I go to Steve, there's another part of this about the Enlightenment perspective, suggesting that human mistakes and wrongdoing are due to a lack of knowledge and can therefore be corrected with, perhaps with technology and engineering. And yet the Christian belief of brokenness, that all humans are inherently broken and only made right through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, so I do think reason and understanding are important. I do think that can range from sort of moral education to trying to understand the implications of policy decisions and trying to do so in a thoughtful and rigorous manner. But again, I do think there are limits, and it is within the capacity of individual human persons to do a great deal of harm. The war in Ukraine has obviously caused a great deal of devastation, and if the decisions of one man, Putin, go in one direction versus another, the choice to, say, employ nuclear warfare, the devastation could be much greater. We don't know. It is, I think, really a contingent matter. And so, yes, I do think there is sort of a brokenness to the human person. I think even when we want to do good, we often do not. I think there is a need for some sort of help and restoration in that regard. That's not to downplay the importance of reason, the importance of moral formation that can take place through ordinary means, but I think it's important to understand the limits as well.
Thank you, Steve. You've written a lot about this.
Yes,
yes,
indeed.
Can summarize, but our MIT audience doesn't necessarily have read all of your awesome books, so you're going to have to.
I have written two books that have kind of pigeonholed me as an optimist because they present, I think, in true MIT spirit, and I did spend 22 years here, data on human flourishing, showing, and as Tyler has mentioned, when you plot measures of human flourishing to the extent that we can measure them over time, they all show an increase. Not everywhere all the time. That would be a miracle, and progress is not a miracle. Progress consists of at least in the Enlightenment spirit, which gave me the title of the book, Enlightenment Now, I would say it's the use of knowledge to enhance flourishing. So I would not say that a lack of progress is due only to a deficit in knowledge, because the knowledge has to be deployed in service of human flourishing. And you can have application of ingenuity together with brute force to further aims that are contrary to human flourishing. And for example, Putin's desire for a great Eurasian civilization centered in Russia and the suffering of the people of Ukraine, and for that matter of Russia, be damned. Greatness is the ultimate good. If that's your goal, then all the knowledge in the world is not going to make us better off. It has to be a combination of understanding how the world works and using that knowledge to make people better off, to further the goals that both Tyler and I mentioned of health and happiness and education and culture and so on. So all of the measures of human flourishing, such as safety and longevity and literacy and happiness and freedom, none of them are a straight line. None of them are even monotonic, and we have seen just in the last couple of years some reversals, including the deaths in war, which since 1946, putting aside even the carnage of World War II, the graph kind of looks like that. It's a declining sawtooth, but the last year there is definitely an uptick. It's taken us back to the level of about 1989. So it's wiped out about 25 years of progress, hopefully temporarily. But it's just one example of how things can get worse, but on average, they've tended to get better. Not through any miracle, not through any moral arc bending toward justice, but just because to the extent that people work toward flourishing and increase their knowledge, if we remember the things that worked, tried not to repeat our mistakes, we can gradually increment upwards. But despite that, the notion of utopia actually gives me the willies. If you look at utopian movements, they have all led to bloodbaths. Nazism, Maoism, Cambodia, Pol Pot, the French Revolution. We should be terrified at the notion of a utopia. Now, is that a contradiction with the desire that human progress has happened and that it is possible that we will enjoy much more? No, for a couple of reasons. One of them is, even though I don't think that as a Jewish atheist, I'm going to leave Jesus out of it, so I don't think that that is part of the of an agenda for flourishing. But there are themes in religions, including Christianity, that reflect distilled human insight, and one of them is that we are flawed creatures. The way I would put it is that we're products of evolution, but we're not angels, and that any social organization has to take into account the capacity of humans toward rather nasty goals, including raw exploitation, as we see in slavery, sadism, the thirst for revenge, the ability that we all have to cultivate sadism, malevolent ideologies such as Putinism, the kind of romantic authoritarian nationalism that puts the glory of empires and civilizations above the flourishing of men, women, and children. So there are a lot, we have the capacity to do awful things. But we also have what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. I believe that there is such a thing as human nature, and that is harmonious with some themes in Christianity. I don't think we are blank slates. I don't think we can be perfected. But we do have countering our inner demons, if you will, our ugly motives, such as dominance and revenge and sadism. We also have a capacity for empathy. By default, we don't apply it very broadly. We tend only to empathize with our family, our friends, cute little fuzzy baby animals, and that's about it. But the circle of empathy can be expanded outward by processes of cosmopolitanism, meeting people who are unlike you, reading the first-person experiences of people unlike you, just realizing rationally, cognitively, that other people have the capacity to flourish and suffer as you do, and that it is incoherent to wish for yourself what you would not grant to others. And what has changed over time, the reason that progress is possible, is that we've developed institutions and norms that are likelier to bring out our better angels, our capacity for self-control, our capacity for empathy, our capacity for reason. The reason that I think it's not a paradox or contradiction to note that utopian movements have led to de facto dystopias, to nightmares, is that different dimensions of human flourishing, for one thing, vary across individuals and certainly across cultures. So for one culture, a vision of utopia might be one of modesty, that women are clad from head to toe. For another, it would be freedom, and women can wear whatever they want. For one, it might be sobriety and restraint. For another, it might be partying and celebrating and getting drunk. So any utopian vision that is enforced indeed any attempt to implement one's own utopian vision will naturally lead to totalitarianism, because there are all these other people, these nuisances out there who want something different from what I want. And so if I'm implementing my utopia, I've got to squash down all those people who have a different vision of utopia. So that's one reason why utopian projects tend to be totalitarian. Also, if you have a vision that doesn't just claim, as I think many of us would, certainly that I would, that there's room for improvement, but that there is a vision of perfection, then anyone who stands in the way, well, they're standing in the way of something that could be infinitely good forever. How much righteous violence are you entitled to expend to prevent them from bringing infinite happiness forever into being? Well, as much as you want. They are kind of infinitely evil, and no measure to repress them or eliminate them is unjustifiable if infinite goodness is your vision. That's one reason. Another is that there are inherently trade-offs even among people who hold the same values, and we don't all hold exactly the same values. So for example, a vision of flourishing would be you do things that are in your long-term interest, that keep you healthy, that work to your own benefit. Pushing against that is human freedom. The problem with human freedom is people can have the freedom to screw up their lives. They can spend too much time on social media to their long-term detriment. They can drink too much. They can eat too much. They can not exercise enough. If we were to achieve perfection in terms of people only doing things that were good for them in the long run, then we would need the social media police, and we'd need the junk food Gestapo, and we need prohibition. So freedom and flourishing can trade off. They're two different dimensions of freedom. There is no optimum that would maximize one unless it came at the expense of the other. Another one is, since we're not all identical, we differ in our talents, we differ in our temperaments. If you have perfect freedom, you will also have inequality. Some people are more enterprising, some people are harder working, some people will start businesses that will make them billionaires, others won't. If you want to prevent that from happening, if you want to make sure that everyone ends up with exactly the same resources, then you're going to have to squash human freedom. No, you can't start that business, because then you'll get richer than someone else, and that will be inequality. So there are inherent trade-offs in the human condition. We can argue about what's the optimal way of trading them off, but if we seek to make one of them perfect, we will necessarily minimize another. So there's a couple of reasons why you can, and I do believe in human improvement. I believe we've seen it. I believe we can reasonably hope for more, but not utopia, not perfection.
I have like 5 questions in response to what you just said, to figure out where to start. One comment that you don't have to respond to right away is you made a comment about being a Jewish atheist, so you don't have to deal with Jesus. You know he was a Jew, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
oh, I know that, yes.
All right, we can come
But his
back
followers,
to that.
by definition, were not.
The names, they started to call themselves Christians later.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by 2 things, and I'd like to hear both points of view on this. One is I think going back to your original definition of human flourishing, it sounded like very much like we could each sort of decide what that would be for us. Is that a fair?
With 2 provisos. One of them is you can't, to the extent that it impinges on someone else's flourishing, or at least I mean, I could if you defining it for yourself, but I think if we were to come up with a definition of flourishing that we think would be applicable, it would not include the right to enslave others or to assault others and so on. Just your flourishing ends where someone else's flourishing begins. But also, even with each individual having the freedom to define flourishing for himself or herself, we do find empirically, and Tyler mentioned this, that there's a lot of overlap. Not everyone all the time, but most people would rather be alive than dead and healthy than sick. And
yeah, there's certainly a lot of common ground across people.
A lot of common ground.
I was just thinking, because you gave the example of Putin and you too, the devastation that's being caused there, which is just horrific. and causes one to wonder, like, is this Putin's definition of flourishing for him and Russia? But you're saying maybe it's not by some higher standard, that when he crosses a line, that's he's violating some greater evil.
Yes, because, and this is the universalizability of at least any characterization of flourishing that we would want to recognize or acknowledge or give people the right to. So if my, if my definition of flourishing is that I have a harem of 400 virgins, well, tough luck, you can't have it. You might call that flourishing, but no, you may not have it, because what about all those virgins? Don't they get a say? And the eunuchs who would guard them. So we do have a way of passing judgment on people's self-definition of what they would call flourishing by the criterion of universality. But no, it's a little Kantian, or maybe a little Rawlsian, or a little golden rule-ish. Or my favorite characterization was one that from Spinoza, another great thinker and Jewish atheist. Those acting under reason wish nothing for themselves that they do not also wish for all of humanity. So it's a generalizability of, at least if you are, you can be selfish, you can be an egoist, you can be a megalomaniac, but then you're not operating under the laws of reason, because there's nothing about you that the laws of logic care about. So if you say, well, I have the right to be alive and healthy and happy, then the pronoun me means nothing. You also have to grant that to all of humanity. And so those are the dimensions of flourishing that I think we are compelled to recognize. We could might even call them rights.
Okay, so it's very interesting because there's a higher standard. And by the way, I want to go back to Tyler, but you have brought up in both your answers sex and harems and women and all this. And every time we're together, you bring this up in interesting ways. So I have a question for you about that. But first, let's go to Tyler. You can wonder for a moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd offer two further comments, though I agree with a fair bit of what Steve said. First, I would say I do think flourishing has both a subjective and an objective component. If someone feels miserable, it's very odd to come to them and say, no, in fact, you are fully flourishing. No, the subjective experience, how we feel in life, is not irrelevant. It's not the only part of flourishing, but ideally we want to be doing what's right and feeling what's right and acting in the right way. That subjective part of it is important. But I think there is an objective side to human flourishing as well. I think something like health or the capacity to reason and to understand. I think even if someone doesn't want these things, it would be odd. But no, this is part of what human nature is. I also believe that there is a spiritual aspect to the human person that is also part of our objective well-being. I need to appreciate the fact that others, like my colleague Steve, disagree and don't see it that way. But to my mind, that is also part of the objective side of well-being. So while I don't think flourishing is just getting whatever we want subject to the constraints of other people, I do think the subjective component is important. I would also say that, to my mind, flourishing, kind of living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, that includes the environments and contexts in which they live, the communities in which they live. We are social, political, communal creatures, and if our communities are not good, then I would say that is actually a part of our lack of flourishing. And I think those sorts of notions can help orient us, if we embrace them, towards what is good, towards working together towards not just trying to maximize our own happiness and desires, but seeing that flourishing as being truly communal.
Thanks. All right. On to secular and Christian humanism. While reason and science are crucial for advancing society, it is worth considering whether we put too much faith in them to achieve progress. On the other hand, humanism, which aims to maximize human flourishing, also plays a vital role, but is sometimes underemphasized. What is humanism's role in achieving progress? And do you think the gospel's unique perspective on human nature offers something that secular humanism cannot? And maybe I'll start with Steve.
Yeah, so I do think that humanism is it's got really the lodestar for human efforts and human progress. Namely, human flourishing is really kind of what it's all about. That's what we should maximize, and if there is a conflict between some other goal in human flourishing, then human flourishing ought to win, simply because, again, I want to flourish, and if I want to flourish, how can I deny you guys the right to flourish? Going back to Spinoza, although this is not uniformly adhered to. You can also have a Nietzschean view of the good, which is that it's heroic striving and accomplishment, great works of art, great works of conquest, and if lots of people get killed, well, it's the price that has to be paid for greatness. So there is an alternative.
Probably Putin's view. Yeah.
Probably Putin. No, I think it is actually. I think that's not an exaggeration. I think that is Putin's view exactly. But of course, you could ask Putin. But what about all those Ukrainians? Don't they get a vote in this too? And that's the problem with the Nietzschean view, is that it already presupposes that it's only the Superman that gets asked. Now, whether it comes from gospel, I would certainly probably not the person to ask, not for lack of expertise, but I would doubt it, although there could be, I do acknowledge, and I've already given an example of an insight from, I don't know if it's directly from the Gospels, but it's sort of implicit in it that humans are flawed, that we're not perfectible, we're not blank slates. And there are probably other insights about human nature that any deeply reflective tradition would tend to discover, because when you ponder humans, there's certain things that conclusions that you'll come to. But I suspect that humanism ultimately will kind of trumps any particular religious doctrine, simply because it is what we all share. That is, when you bring people together and say, well, what characterization of human flourishing can we all agree on? Well, it can't literally be, say, salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus, because then you're going to leave out the Hindus, and you're going to leave out the Jews, and you're going to leave out a lot of humanity. But interestingly, it doesn't leave you, and it can't be something. You can't be Russian greatness or American greatness. You might say, well, does that mean that there's kind of a lowest common denominator, that there's going to be the null set once you eliminate everyone's particular vision of flourishing? And it turns out both empirically and, I think, rationally, no. And Tyler gave a list: health and literacy and social connection and creating works of knowledge and beauty. And empirically, people can and have, when necessary, agreed on them. And my favorite example is when the deliberations to come up with a universal declaration of human rights in the ashes of World War II, largely spearheaded by Eleanor Roosevelt. One of the challenges was, well, how can you say that the Nazis would be guilty of genocide within their own borders? Okay, well, then they illegally conquered Poland and they killed a lot of Jews there, and so we'll convict them of war crimes. But gee, they're in their own country, they have sovereignty. Can't they pass any law they want, including we can murder all the Jews and Roma and gay people? So the challenge was, is there something universal where no, even if you're a country exercising sovereignty, you don't get to set up gas chambers? And is there something that the whole world will agree on? Now, that might seem hopeless, the whole world. And so Roosevelt, with the help of a number of other thinkers and leaders, assembled scholars and moralists and religious leaders from all of the world's major religions and secular traditions. You had experts of Hinduism and Confucianism and Islam. And to everyone's surprise, they came up with a list. And it wasn't the null set. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has, 48 statutes. And they were things that were on Tyler's list of basically flourishing and freedom and security and all of that. So there is a robust conception of flourishing and hence a morality based on flourishing, which I would call humanism. And I would dare say, and those of you who maybe are more expert in the history of religion than I am could either support or refute it. But my sense is that a lot of religions have been historically moving in a direction of humanism. So if you look at the Ecumenical Council in Catholicism in the early 1960s, the so-called Vatican II, if you look at the development of, in Judaism from the Torah, which is a pretty bloodthirsty document, to the Talmud, to, after the Jewish Enlightenment, to Reform Judaism and Humanistic Judaism and Reconstructionism. If you look at the evolution of Protestantism, if you look at the evolution of Mormonism, where there was a revelation in the 1960s that African Americans did not bear the mark of Cain after all, and they could have high positions in the Mormon church. Churches tend to, churches and mosques and synagogues and so on, I think tend to move in the direction of humanism and tend to divest themselves of some of the more parochial and less humanistic aspects of their dogmas and their catechism, not necessarily literally, but at least in practice, in terms of what is what you actually abide by, even if you may pay lip service to your gospels, your scriptures. And I think there's a reason for that, and that is as the world becomes more united, as we learn about some of the horrors of parochial sectarian ideologies, there are pressures to go more global, more cosmopolitan, more humanist. But that's a speculation.
Thanks. And I realize we want to avoid jargon here, and I realize the word gospel may not be interpreted the same way to everyone, so I probably should have clarified, and feel free to disagree with me. The Gospels usually refers to the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, four books of the Christian New Testament. The gospel, I believe, is literally a translation of good news, translates as good news, which in the good news in the Christian faith is that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, Jesus, to die for everyone. And that does not, I think you made a comment about that, leaves out Hindus, Jews, or whatever. It actually doesn't. It's for everybody. You can have Jewish Christians and Hindus who accept Jesus' gift and so forth. It's absolutely universal in its teaching. So that's just an important point of clarification. All are invited. Yes, Tyler.
Okay, so we've got the question of reason, the role of reason in science, and are we putting too much faith in them, the question of humanism, and then the distinct contribution of Christianity and the Christian gospel. So on sort of the question of reason and science, I don't think we can have too much reason. I don't think we can have too much science. I think advances in reason, advances in science, better application of reason is always advantageous. I think that it has led to an extraordinary progression in knowledge. It has contributed enormously to the trends that Steve brought up earlier. So I think this is important. Can we have too much faith in these things? I think we can. I think if we neglect that the human person is free and sometimes uses that knowledge for wrong purposes. If we think that reason and science are going to solve all of our problems, I do think we can have too much faith in them, but not too much reason, not too much science per se. With humanism, I essentially agree with Steve in what he said. I mean, I would view humanism as really any effort to help the human person achieve their potential. And as noted earlier, and as Steve pointed out as well, there's a lot on which we agree. And so I think we should be working together to advancing those goals. Again, to my mind, those are not just material goals of health and longevity and literacy and income, but also should be pointing towards the experience of beauty, of meaning, of trying to be a good person, of good relationships. And so I think we should be working together to use both our science and reason and also those humanistic impulses to try to bring that about as a society, to work across religious traditions, to work across the religious-secular divide, to work with all peoples to achieve that. And I agree that the Declaration of Rights is an extraordinary accomplishment in that regard, and we should do whatever we can. With regard to the distinctive contributions of Christianity itself towards humanism, towards flourishing. One might point towards the historical contributions in terms of understanding the equality of peoples or charity, or the contributions to science. One might point towards the proportion of healthcare in African countries that the churches and other religious organizations are providing. One might point to, and this is a topic of some of my own research, the contribution of participating in religious community towards health and well-being, lowering depression, suicide, reducing mortality risk and divorce and so on. But I think those are kind of more historical and empirical questions. In terms of Christianity's contribution to our understanding of humanism, of human flourishing, a lot could be said, but I'll perhaps restrict my remarks to three things. I think first, the centrality of love, the sort of basing, the encapsulating the whole of morality, the whole of ethics as essentially love of neighbor and of God. And extending that so far as love of enemy as well in Jesus' teachings. And I think we're actually in great need of that in this country. I think with the political polarization that we're seeing, we need that love of the opponent. We need a sense of forgiveness if we really are going to come together. And so I think both the teachings on love, but then the motivations to love. Examples like the life of Mother Teresa, who gave her life caring for others. One anecdote is a news reporter saw her doing her work and said, I wouldn't do this for $1 million. And her response was, neither would I. What was motivating her was that love of other people. And I think it is a love that's both taught by Christianity, but also empowered. But I think her example points to, I would say, a second contribution of Christianity to our understanding of true and real humanism, true flourishing, which is that of making sense of suffering. What do we do when we suffer? Do we ignore this? Is there any value in that suffering? And again, a lot could be said on this topic, but I think there's both a notion of voluntary suffering for the sake of helping others, of loving others, but then there's also kind of trying to make use of and understand the suffering one experiences in one's own life for the purposes of transformation, to turn one's desires, one's will towards the higher goods, and again, from a Christian perspective, ultimately towards God. So I think there's a kind of a second contribution in trying to make sense of and find meaning in the midst of suffering, which we really do all encounter. And then, lastly, and I think this is really effectively the heart of Christianity, is that attainment of that spiritual well-being, that communion with God. And again, we could go on and on with regard to the theology around this, but with regard to trying to attain that communion, I think there are kind of three central and difficult challenges. One is if you really view that communion as an understanding of a vision of God, that is beyond our capacity. So how do we attain this? This is something that's in some sense superhuman. Secondly, how do we reconcile our brokenness or imperfectibility, the fact that we do wrong, with someone that is perfectly good? How is that reconciled? And then thirdly, it's sort of this notion of if what is central is love of God, but love involves freedom, how is it that we can freely come to love? And I think those three problems are addressed within Christianity as being Jesus Christ's incarnation in the world, his atonement, his death, and his empowering us to love. His becoming a human person, is uniting himself with human nature. The understanding is that does eventually help us, equip us, and give us that supernatural capacity eventually to see God. The atonement, his death, the understanding, the theological understanding, is that's the way that we are reconciled with respect to our own brokenness, our own imperfectibility, our own wrongdoing, our own guilt, and God's perfection. It's that union with Jesus on the cross. And then, lastly, with love, it is God's helping us, drawing us in through the life of Jesus, and hopefully through the loving actions of the church. So I think it's sort of, those are in more theological, abstract terms. I mean, as an analogy, one might envision a person on a ship who can't swim, and the ship is burning. And what are they to do? Imagine someone else on the ship grabbing the person and who can swim, jumping into the water and helping them swim. That still requires the cooperation of the individual who would otherwise drown or burn to death. But in some sense, that pulling one off of the ship is that deliverance from our wrongdoing. That assistance in swimming is what was accomplished by the incarnation, by Jesus as becoming man, uniting human nature to himself. And then again, we do need that cooperation, however, to swim to the surface, to swim to safety. And critically, importantly, part of that learning to swim is in fact loving others, contributing to their well-being, seeking those common ends of humanism, helping people to obtain their highest material, intellectual, moral, cultural, and spiritual ends. So I do think, again, from the Christian understanding, there are important and unique contributions that Christianity makes to the notion of human flourishing.
I love that you brought up love your enemy. What a hard challenge for all of us. And whether you're Christian or not, if Putin would do that, imagine how the world would be different, huh? All right, it's time for us to move to audience Q&A. Before you got here tonight, there were some people who already submitted a giant list of questions that I printed, but you're going to give me a live list where people can upvote what they want. And I may start with one or two that are on the existing list while you go online and upvote and enter new questions as well. Thank you, Lucas. Awesome. All right, I'm gonna start with one that I'm really curious about, because we like to measure this stuff in our work, and I have a lot to learn from you guys. How do you measure objectively, quantitatively, human flourishing? And then the student who asked this also said, do these metrics provide evidence of progressivism? So I don't know who wants to go first.
He probably does it for a living,
I can
right?
describe a little bit of what we're trying to do at the human flourishing program. And I think any attempt at measuring psychosocial constructs is always going to be partial. It's always going to be imperfect. There are always things that are going to be missing. So it's important to supplement any quantitative measurement with an understanding of people's experience, with more qualitative work. That said, I do think it's worthwhile carrying out quantitative assessments. And in each of those domains that I had mentioned earlier, happiness, health, meaning, character, relationships. We take two questions drawn principally from what is often used in the well-being literature, but they are self-report. So they are subjective assessments of how an individual sees themselves doing. And so there are limitations that self-report. You're not going to capture everything. There are social desirability biases. There are self-deception biases. But for certain uses, they're actually quite reasonable if you're just looking at how is a person faring over time. I'm not comparing them to other people, because some might exaggerate more than others, but just how is an individual doing over time. That can be helpful. They can be helpful in randomized trials, because although there are all sorts of biases that arise by randomization, those biases are going to be balanced, in fact. And so we can look at how different interventions or programs might enhance these various aspects of flourishing. It can be helpful to see who's doing well and who's not, and for those who are not, to offer help, to offer support. So while we have to be careful about over-interpreting quantitative assessments, while these biases are real, while we can't just say, oh, look, Sweden, the happiness is 7.3, in Japan it's only 7.1, and therefore Sweden must be happier. That's a problematic use. There are plenty of uses which are helpful, which are good, and I think to best advance human flourishing, we should be doing some sort of quantitative assessment. We should be using the tools of the social and biomedical sciences to try to advance these different aspects of human well-being.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. If you want to find out whether someone's happy, you can't do much better than asking them. I mean, who's a better judge? There's the old joke of the communist orator in the 1930s who thunders, "Come the revolution, everyone will be eating strawberries and cream." And a little man at the front says, "But I don't like strawberries and cream." He said, "Come the revolution, you will like strawberries and cream." So if you find that funny, you see why, at least prima facie, asking someone what they want, what makes them happy, is certainly the place you start. And as Tyler mentioned, it so happens that it does tend to correlate with anything else we'd like to count as a measure of happiness. It correlates with how happy other people say that person is. It correlates with activity in the parts of the brain that light up when you see pictures of cute little bunnies. Its predictors tend to be things that we would guess should make people happy. Like on average, wealthier countries have happier people. On average, freer countries have happier people. On average, and Tyler, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but on average, countries with more social connection and social trust tend to have people who say by their own lights they're happier. So the picture kind of coheres that even though you might say, well, how could you possibly measure happiness quantitatively? Well, asking people either how happy are you or how good is your life, they don't correlate perfectly, but they correlate reasonably well, and they seem to measure something meaningful.
We'll add just kind of one further comment there. While I do think kind of questions along the lines of how satisfied are you with your life as a whole are pretty good if you're going to ask a single question, I do think it's important to look at the nuances, to look at the different dimensions of well-being, because while they are unquestionably correlated, the trends can go in different directions. Again, I think one of the more, in some ways, unsettling results, I wouldn't say this is definitive. We're trying to do a more thorough global flourishing study at present, but I'd say the evidence we have to date suggests levels of meaning and purpose are higher in poorer developing countries than in richer developed countries. So what's going on there? Levels of happiness are higher in richer developed countries, but it's the reverse with meaning and purpose. So have we carried out economic development in a way which compromises meaning and purpose? Have we lost sight of those cultural, moral, social aspirations by focusing too much on the material. So I do think it's important to kind of do these more nuanced assessments rather than just lie on sort of a single overarching question. If we can only ask one question, fine, we should do it. Some data is better than nothing. But I think to really more fully understand, get a fuller picture of human flourishing, asking across these different domains of flourishing is quite important.
Stop me if this one hasn't been replicated given the replication crisis, but I had heard too of the study where people, when they're asked with experience sampling frequently during the day, especially if they're like a new parent, how do you feel right now? And it's like miserable, and another poopy diaper, and I'm exhausted, and it's all like negative, negative, negative. But you ask them how happy they are overall. I'm so happy, I'm a parent, I have this wonderful child. So there's this interesting difference between reflecting on this, this momentary suffering and this greater meaning and purpose that brings joy that I might liken for all the non-parents at MIT to all the suffering you're doing with every P-set and every quiz, but then you get that degree, right? You have that amazing accomplishment of making it through the semester and making progress.
Yeah, no, I think the phenomena is real, and I also think Steve touched on this earlier. Some of this is kind of time horizon as well. How do you trade off momentary happiness for a longer-term happiness? One of my other favorite examples of this is if you kind of do the time sampling and ask people about how happy they are when doing their homework, they're often not too happy, and yet you look longitudinally, and those who are doing their homework years later are in fact the ones that are happy. So it is I think a difficult question with regard to how to navigate those trade-offs. But I think a lot of the research studies suggest that those who have the capacity to delay gratification, to aim for that longer-term happiness, are often benefited in the end. And to my mind, that is some of the Christian answer to suffering as well. It's that that suffering does have the capacity to lead ultimately to a greater joy, both in this life, as you see the lives of others transformed, but also then in the life to come. So in some ways, I think it's a very similar phenomenon.
All right, on to our most upvoted question. If belief in an imperially false religious doctrine or dogma causes one to live under a mental framework that enables human flourishing, regardless of the otherwise objective measures mentioned here, health, reasoning, etc., would you be a proponent of those believing in it? And do you believe the current religions of the world are offering such a solution?
Well, there is the paradox that if people believing certain things that objectively we deem to be false depends on them not hearing the evidence that bearing on whether they're true or false, is this a measure to withhold that evidence from them, to keep them in ignorance, because if they might learn this dangerous knowledge, then they might be less happy? If so, then I would say no, that you shouldn't withhold knowledge from people. If people have the right to not believe something that they think will make them less happy, even if it's true, I would say that when it comes to the individual, we all probably have some degree of either choosing not to know, not wanting to find out, perhaps comforting beliefs that we don't want to probe too deeply, and I would not want to live in a society in which people weren't allowed to cultivate these benign delusions. When it comes to the policies of a society, when it comes to the information that government acts on, that gets translated into laws, there the truth is better. And I suspect that they're correlated, that in general, you're not going to have a society that can can deliver flourishing to its citizens for long if it's based on false ideas of how the world works, of cause and effect. So in practice, it may not arise.
So truth matters, and I'll remind people that Veritas means truth. All right, that's what we're here part to discuss. Great.
Yeah, I would essentially agree with what Steve had said. I think in some sense, our highest natural capacity is that for reason and understanding, and so I think truth is an extremely high good. I do not think it should be sacrificed for the sake of something else. And I think that free inquiry, that free pursuit of truth is important, as is probably already evident. I mean, I do believe that the rough outline of the Christian understanding of reality is true, and if it were not, I would want to not believe it. Now, I understand that there are many others out there who don't believe this, and I want to engage with and respect their pursuit of truth as well. So whether sort of secular colleagues or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu, I mean, I hope all of us are trying to seek truth and through conversations challenge each other's beliefs. I mean, I would say, yes, if someone thinks that their own religion, their own system of understanding is true, does correspond in some sense to reality, then even though I don't think it's true, I don't think that the Hindu understanding gets things quite right, I would still say, no, I mean, I think it's good that they're participating in these communities. I think these communities do contribute to their lives, provided they are genuinely seeking the truth. So I do think truth is prioritized, but I think in the context of a pluralistic society, we need to take into account that others are in the same boat as we are. They think they have the right, the true understanding, and the communities uniting around that, I think, are contributing on the whole, on average, to their well-being.
Thank you. Our next highest voted question is for Dr. Pinker. If your, oops, it just popped up here. If your human flourishing ends where mine begins, is socialism, universal healthcare, et cetera, antithetical because someone is forced to provide it?
Is it indefensible?
Antithetical.
Oh, antithetical.
Yeah. If your human flourishing ends where mine begins.
You mean that if I have to pay for your health care, then I have to take something out of my wallet and I'm poorer? Is that how we should interpret the question?
If the person who asked it, who got maximally upvoted here, feels comfortable speaking up, feel free to jump in and clarify what you're looking for. Yes.
Am I not forced to pay for your health care? Aren't you exploiting me for your universal health care? Isn't that antithetical to my personal freedom?
Well, if freedom is you keep 100% of your paycheck in a society in which your paycheck depends on big networks of cooperation, that is, you didn't kind of claw all that wealth to yourself, but you depended on institutions like the government, like schools, like universities, like the court system. So you're already a member of a club. People who are members of a club do have to pay dues. The clubs do have a right to prevent them from being exploited by people who get all the goodies without contributing something. So I think that a priori there is a reason why things like taxes in a society are justified, even though they are an infringement on freedom in the sense that if I don't pay my taxes, men will haul me off and put me in jail. So I think that you can justify that as opposed to a kind of libertarian utopia in which no one contributes anything to the society in which they live. But also I think we can look at it empirically and say, well, even if we had arguments of whether we'd be better off where rich people can pay for all the health care they can afford and poor people get only what they can afford, you can, even if you thought that would be justifiable, you can just empirically look at how well societies do with or without socialized healthcare. Now, it turns out all affluent democracies do have some degree of socialized healthcare, including the United States with, for example, Medicare and with Obamacare. We can say how healthy are people in those societies? Do they lead to totalitarianism? Is there a slippery slope that if you have universal health care, the next thing is you'll have Mao Zedong? Which is kind of the Hayek argument of the road to serfdom, that if you have any kind of redistribution, you'll inevitably have societies being both poorer and less free. Empirically, does the historical record say that's true? And I'd say the answer is no. It could have turned out that way, but Canada and New Zealand and Switzerland and Norway are pretty pleasant places to live. They got a lot of freedom and they're affluent. We also know, again, this is not a normative argument by itself, but it probably is telling us something, that the direction in which societies go is to provide more for their citizens, paid for by taxes. There may be a desirable place to live, an affluent democracy with no taxes, with no redistribution whatsoever, with no social spending. It's never existed on Earth, which kind of leads you to think that maybe this is one of those utopian schemes that you really ought not to strive for, that we should look at the world and history as a kind of laboratory as to which societies work better than others. And I think that kind of data from the world would say that the amount the United States has toward healthcare is probably not optimum. We have a relatively crummy healthcare system compared to a lot of other countries, and we pay a lot more for it. So there's the theoretical argument that taxes are not theoretical and empirical argument that taxes don't lead to totalitarianism by themselves. We have the empirical argument that societies that do have some degree of subsidized healthcare are healthier, waste less money on healthcare, are not on slippery slopes to totalitarianism.
All right, I have a question for Tyler and then one for both of you. Tyler, you mentioned that religious people may show more flourishing. During your studies, are you able to separate flourishing due to having a like-minded community versus flourishing due to personal belief?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I would say that other forms of community participation are unquestionably also related to higher flourishing, and I think likewise should be promoted. I think one of the real losses during the COVID-19 pandemic has been the deterioration of community, and I think we need to work hard to rebuild those communities. I think it is both constitutive of flourishing and contributes to these various aspects of flourishing. I mean, having said that, I would say the best data suggests that, and this is mostly kind of US, Europe data. There have been fewer rigorous studies done in the rest of the world. Hopefully that'll be changing in due course. But if you look at religious community compared to other forms of community life, you do tend to get larger effect sizes with religious communities than with other forms of community. In our studies on mortality or suicide or cardiovascular disease, religious community was sort of a stronger association over time with those outcomes than did all other social indicators in the study, including being married, time spent with friends, time spent with family, time spent in other community groups, or the composite of all of those. So although other forms of community life contribute, the effects of religious community seem to be larger. However, if you look at, again, these are the statistical associations over time with simple beliefs or private practices, you find relatively little association with those health and well-being outcomes over time. So I think what this suggests is that sort of the coming together of the religious and the social that's giving religious community life its power. It's that shared understanding of the world. It's the participation in an institution that extends beyond one's own life. It's that sense of common purpose and common end, that seeking of what is transcendent, and that doing all of this together that seems to be giving religious community its effects. So it is, I think, an important social undertaking. And I think that would certainly be the teaching of the Christian faith itself, that it's not our coming to this as individuals, but as a church, as a community. And I would say that's reflected in the longitudinal statistical associations as well.
So the social is very important, but it's not as good as the social and the faith coming together.
With regard to the associations with subsequent health and well-being.
But if I understand it, and I think this is what you said, at least consistent with my understanding, that even though the religious institutions, communities lead to greater flourishing, it's not the belief of the individuals. So if you've got, if, for example, the wife is very religious and she schleps her husband along to all of the church socials and charity arrangements, he's just as happy as anyone else, even though he doesn't believe a word of it, but he is a member of this very healthful community.
That's actually more complicated. I mean, I wouldn't say we have definitive evidence on this yet, but some studies suggesting if there's a discordance between the person's belief
that itself can be a source of unhappiness.
That can create cognitive difficulties, greater sense of depression. I wouldn't say that's results definitive, but there's some indication of that in the literature. So again, I think it's the coming together. The belief on its own without community participation, doesn't do much with regard to health and well-being in this country, at least over time. But that belief seems to be critical to activate the power of that communal life, the powerful social effects in creating health and well-being. So it's nuanced.
It's nuanced, and if the unit of analysis isn't individuals, but states and countries, then in general, the more religious states don't do as well. They have shorter lifespans, lower happiness, lower levels of education, and that's generally true of countries as well. So if you think of like a really, really religious country, like Afghanistan, you really don't want to live there. And if you think of a really much more secular country like Finland or Sweden or the Netherlands, they're pretty pleasant places to live. Likewise, among American states, the most religious American states are, I think, Mississippi and Alabama, and they don't do so well in the human flourishing department. So there are many, many ways of interpreting that, and it's just one of the other nuances, together with the fact that at the individual level, people who belong to religious communities do tend to flourish more.
Yeah. So then that kind of raises questions of direction of causation there, and I think the evidence there suggests that as societies develop, they become less religious. So it's not that religion itself is leading to the declines in the lower levels of human flourishing. Again, every indication is that it's doing at the individual level the reverse, but there's pretty clear evidence that as societies develop, they tend to become less religious. And to my mind, that raises questions of how are we carrying out economic development? Are we compromising questions of meaning and purpose? Are we compromising spiritual ends in pursuit of material goods? And I don't want to deny that material goods are goods. These things are important. The achievements with regard to health and literacy have been extraordinary. But I think we shouldn't limit are indicators of the progress of nations to those economic indicators. They should be a part of it, unquestionably, but I think we want to carry out development in a way that respects the totality of a human person.
All right. Actually, is that true of China and Korea as they've become more developed? Because they're becoming more Christian, but would you say that's consistent with what you just said, or a counterexample?
So, I mean, these are all averages.
Okay.
I mean, even at the individual level, you can find plenty of examples of people who've had really negative experiences in religious communities, and it has not contributed to their flourishing. So, all of these analyses really are averages over
large
variety
numbers of countries
experiences.
or whatever.
But I mean, even in secular societies like Denmark or Finland or China, you still find at the individual level the protective associations of religious participation on longevity. I don't think that's going to be a universal phenomena. I don't think participation in Christianity in first century Rome was likely associated with a longer lifespan. So some of this is context specific. Evidence also that the effect sizes are larger in more religious societies than less, but you still find them in most less, more secular societies as well at the individual level.
Very interesting. You guys have such amazing data knowledge on these things. I think we could dig into details for quite some time. All right, top voted question for both of you. Who defines what is a human right? Many cultures don't believe that humans have rights. Are they equally correct?
I would say no. And I think this is part of the delicate balance of trying to attain consensus. I think one wants consensus as broad as possible across countries and individuals and peoples, but also on a range of topics that we should be promoting together. And those two goals are in some conflict with one another. The more we try to promote with respect to human rights or human flourishing, the narrower of a group that will get to agree to this. So I don't have the answer as to what that right balance is, but to my mind, there is such a thing as human nature. To my mind, having been created in the image of God, we do have rights that follow directly from being a human person, and so I think, to my mind, they're wrong. But I do think one of the remarkable things about the Declaration of Human Rights was bringing together people who had a very different understanding of the grounds of the justification for these rights. And so I think that effort of trying to find consensus, trying to promote a real and a robust humanism is really central to the flourishing of our world.
Yeah. And of course you can't, the thing is you do get different answers depending on who you ask. Not everyone is in favor of human rights, but if you ask a dictator, do you think human rights are a good thing? And he says, no, I think human rights lead to chaos and anarchy and spiritual degradation. Well, don't you think you should also ask all those people in that country ruled by the dictator what they think? And if you say, no, we don't care what they think, we only care what the dictator thinks, or then you've already prejudged the answer to the question. If you get to ask everyone, then I think you do get much less disagreement, especially when it comes to their rights. And when it comes to their rights, and they say, well, and if you just turn the tables, and it's like, well, if I were in charge, then I would oppress him who's now oppressing me. Well, you can still say, well, then doesn't he get a say in the society in which you're the king? And then if you ask everyone, then you come down to what we all have in common, namely our common humanity, our common desire to flourish, and you do end up with human rights. If everyone gets a say. Now, if you say, well, sorry, not everyone gets a say, well, then why doesn't everyone get a say? What makes you so special?
So it sounds to me like you're appealing to a higher value that everybody should have a say. There's kind of an equality assumed in this, like a human rights equality assumed in your answer.
So that is it circular? Is it only a justification of human rights if you already believe in human rights? I don't think so, because it's the default has to be that if you're posing the question in the first place, then you are soliciting opinions which presupposes that other people have the opinions to contribute. That is, you're already, as soon as you open the floodgates to discussion, there's no principled way of keeping anyone out. If you can say, well, I don't care what you think, I'm just going to impose it on you, then you can deny that kind of equality. But if you're posing it as a question, anyone who is in principle capable of reason and anyone who has an interest, therefore, is entitled to answer. That is, there's no principal way of excluding them, even raising the question, having the debate in the first place.
All right, we are at 8:36, and can I do one more? Okay. All right. I think I would like to end on a personal question, if that's okay, from Avery. Do you feel like you are personally flourishing? If so, can you identify the adoption or dropping of certain attitudes, habits that enabled that? And I'll also just invite you, since this is the last question, if you have recommendations for everybody, because we know in particular young people right now are, well, everybody's struggling since the pandemic. Young people in particular are really, and the majority of young people are struggling. So words of advice as well. Thank you.
Well, if I were to deny that I was flourishing, no one should take me seriously. That would be a kind of cosmic ingratitude for someone who's living in an affluent democracy, in peace, healthy, employed, married. There are so many things that can go wrong. There's so many ways in which people can suffer. There's so many ways people are suffering that it would be unbelievably obtuse for someone in our position to deny that we're flourishing. So could I flourish more? Yeah, of course I could. But it begins with sheer gratitude and therefore a recognition of the imperative to allow as many other people to flourish as I'm fortunate enough to flourish. People in this country, people in other countries. So yeah, I can complain and I can fetch and bitch and moan about all the things that I could imagine be better. But just looking at human history, looking at the world today, I begin with a position of tremendous gratitude for my blessings in this society, but also being in this society as opposed to Ukraine and Afghanistan and all of the other parts of the world with greater suffering. What leads to it? Well, it's personally, I do think gratitude is huge, and I think that literature on human flourishing shows that there's a correlation. I don't know if it's causal between gratitude and other elements of well-being. I think there's some. It's never. Whenever I ask for generic advice on living a good life, I always hesitate simply because so many questions are questions of balance, of trade-offs. I work hard, but not to the exclusion of spending time with family and friends and enjoying beauty. I try to be good to others, but I have to admit I treat my family better than strangers. There are countless trade-offs, and I think probably one of the reason that it's not easy to give an aphorism for how to live a good life is you got to take all these things into account and find a good balance. Maybe that's the answer.
Yeah, so I would say that sort of like Steve pointed out, I am very grateful for what I have. If one looks at sort of the flourishing data that we're collecting around the world, on the whole, doing relatively well. I have a lot to be grateful for. I do think flourishing is, as I said before, kind of multidimensional, so one can be flourishing in ways more profoundly than in others. One can be flourishing in certain ways and struggling in other ways. I do sort of take my own medicine, and I go through our flourishing questions every quarter to kind of see what's going on. And there are some real challenges. I think there are challenges in the academic life. It is tremendously rewarding, but also tremendously demanding. I work a whole lot more than I would like, and there are losses there. There are losses to relationships. There are losses to my happiness and feeling I have insufficient leisure. Now, as the compared to much of the world, I do have a great deal to be grateful for. But I think it is a difficult and delicate balance. For me, some of the things that have been most central in sustaining my flourishing amidst what has often been a very demanding academic career has been making both my spiritual life and my family life central. That's what comes first. Work often consumes almost all of the rest, but having something that is foundational, that's pointing towards the sort of the social, moral, cultural, spiritual ends of the human person has been very much sustaining for me. In terms of other pieces of advice, how do we sustain flourishing? I think Steve's comment on gratitude is right on, and there's experimental evidence that it is causal. Randomized trials of gratitude interventions suggest that it produces greater levels of happiness, reduces depressive symptoms, improves quality of sleep. So simple thing to do is 3 times a week, write down 3 things you're grateful for and why. We do this over our dinner table. And I do think it has profound effects. Acts of kindness activities, likewise tested in randomized trials. Once a week for the next 6 weeks, choose a day, do 5 acts of kindness that you wouldn't otherwise do. And likewise, that contributes to one's well-being in addition to helping other people. And there's actually a large literature on this based on experimental studies on different activities to help one flourish. We have a little flourishing app that you can download from our website that are an evidence-based guide. Now, I think one also needs to realize the limitations of this. A lot of these improve happiness, some improvement in health, but tend to not do much more for meaning and purpose, or for character development, or for good relationships. A lot of the positive psychology interventions that have tried to improve purpose have failed. Much of that's unpublished. I think for these other aspects of well-being, simple, easy-to-use activities aren't sufficient. I think for those we need deeper relational, communal, institutional commitments in the workplace, within education, within family, within religious communities. I think it's these things, this communal life, and a commitment to working through what are often difficulties and unpleasantness of that leads to the deeper, greater purpose, that leads to the formation of character, that leads to deeper relationships. So once again, as I said before, I think we need, as individuals and as a society, to reinvest in community. I don't think it is possible to attain full flourishing without that.